own assets and spying on New Zealanders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker.
Clear. Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'll acknowledge the work done by the members of the Commerce Committee sitting on the other side of the House, in particular the Chair, Jonathan Young. I think it's important to show the respect that we have for each other on working on this sort of legislation. And I also like to acknowledge the sensible comments of Andrew Williams around the time that it has taken to get to this point. And you've got to ask yourself, when it comes back to the House after a prolonged select committee process, how it can sit on the order paper for another year before it gets to this point. And that is a problem in this House, particularly with legislation that is needed to put in place a regime, a regulatory regime, to basically deal with the situation that saw, and 12 months ago, it was 61 finance companies that failed in 4 years. And 61 finance companies, Andrew Williams mentioned the 250,000 investors. This was a very serious issue, and it's taken another year for it to get back to this stage, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's also important that we look at this and we think that while this is dealing with the shortcomings of our regulatory system that was partly responsible at least for these financial company failures, because no single entity took responsibility for the problem, and this bill ensures now that the Financial Markets Authority has broad oversight of the sector, and it ensures that Kiwi investors don't face this sort of disaster again. But the fact is that it's not enough. And there should be other pieces of work going through this House right now. There should be legislation being discussed in this House right now, and this is with reference to the member on the Select Committee, Sam Lotoinga, who has, as I understand it, a loan sharks bill that's sitting languishing at number 40-something on the order paper, which is supposedly that this government had big fanfare about more than a year ago, that has been languishing, not being progressed, that deals with our most vulnerable members of society and the way that they are being exploited. That's a key piece of legislation that should be being dealt with. It was introduced in April this year. And it still hasn't progressed any further. And the other thing that should be being progressed through this House right now is the issue of tax fraud, Mr. Speaker. Tax fraud and tax evasion. And that is something that this government, that government on that side of the House, should actually be bringing measures before us as to how they're going to address those issues. The $1.2 billion a year estimated by IRD in tax discrepancies, and the $140 million a year in actual tax fraud. And instead, what we see is the focus on welfare fraud, which is estimated at around $20 million or a year in relationship fraud. The discrepancies and the prioritisation is extraordinary, and I think that that government should be held to account on its lack of attention to those two key pieces of work that they should be focusing on. I'd like to make some comments about the Greens' position on this bill, because it disturbs me that I've heard them speak in the second reading of this bill after the bill came back from the Select Committee, and now I've heard them speak again tonight and oppose this bill because they say that they don't believe that the criminal sanctions in this bill are actually going to be able to be implemented. Well, can I say that there was, and I'd like to acknowledge the officials that worked on this bill. There was a lot of really hard work, and they were put under the spotlight and measures such as this as to whether or not those criminal sanctions would actually have an effect. And I'd like to make a couple of comments on it, because the committee received a number of submissions on the appropriate mental or fault element for criminal liability. And the main issues that the submitters focused on was whether knowledge or recklessness was an appropriate threshold for the serious criminal offences in the bill. A lot of submitters actually told us that they thought that was far too strict and that we shouldn't be going there, that it was too low or too uncertain. Submitters either preferred knowledge alone, noting that it included willful blindness, or suggested that there should be proof of dishonesty. What we heard was we were told that the meaning of recklessness is not unclear. It has a standard element of criminal intent in criminal law. Its meaning is clear and well established, and that there must be foresight of dangerous consequences that could well happen with an intention to continue the course of conduct regardless. The bill does not criminalise reckless conduct or risk-taking generally, but what it does is impose criminal consequences only where a person is reckless as to a particular circumstance that attracts liability. This was very carefully thought through. The advice that we were given was very strong and clear, and in the end the committee determined that this was the right approach to take. And I think we're going to see the outcome of this bill. And to vote against it purely on that basis, I think, has an element of recklessness in it, given the amount of work. Yes, it's taken far too long to get to this point, but the amount of work that's gone into it, the amount of thought that's gone into it, I think that it is worthy of giving it the benefit of the doubt. This principal policy objective behind this bill, as you've all heard, is to facilitate capital market activity in order to help businesses fund growth and individuals reach their financial goals. But it's also about working for investors, because investors must have confidence in the integrity of the financial markets. This weighty tome of a bill, a doorstopper of a bill, big kahuna, whatever you want to call it, is actually all it represents: integrity in our system. It was begun under a Labor government, under the work that Leanne Dalzell did in the Capital Market Development Task Force, and it's ultimately about ensuring that investors, particularly those investors, those everyday investors, that they can be reassured that there is a system in place that brings all of those parts of the system together, that there's accountability, that there's responsibility, and that ultimately there are sanctions in place if things go wrong. That is the objective of this bill. I also want to acknowledge the work of Clayton Cosgrove in the development of that significant and substantial amendment, the SOP that he produced, and I'd also like to acknowledge the work of the Minister in pushing this bill through. Yes, it's being pushed through in its committee stage and third reading under urgency, but it has taken too long to get to the House, and I do hope that the government will pay attention to the priorities that it needs to focus on next.
Speaker.
Honourable Shane Jones.
Kia ora no tātou. E noho nei roto I tō tātou whare I tēnei pō. Sir,